Hello, Magic. What a very good racehorse this Dubawi is, and he's a Magic Millions, well, a successful graduate. And now let's get on to part two of our show. Very interesting part. I've got Peter Gibson. He is the CEO of Racing South Africa. Peter, thanks very much for coming. And we're at a stage now where people are waiting for questions because the 2 years is nearly up. There's this ban that we had. And you've broken it down into two parts. This is going to be basically part one for the public.
Correct, yeah. Thanks very much for having me, as usual. You know, we haven't been on for a while. Yeah. We are in the end of our 2-year suspension as a result of that outbreak. And I thought this was just an opportunity to review what happens, where we've come from. And we'll follow up in July once we've had a chance to look at the EU report. There's an audit has just been completed. And that'll give a very much more technical base in terms of how we move forward. Touch on this report. Okay, the auditors or the audit team came out here. No comment of what they thought.
No. They didn't say to you, Peter, we're very happy, or Peter, you're under the cosh. No comments.
No. Look, firstly, it's a government-to-government responsibility or relationship. So, in other words, the South African Veterinary Services under Department of Agriculture hosted them. And we're with the audit team who are made up of 3 veterinarians who are based in Ireland. They were all French. And they came around and they look at every component of veterinary services, AHS controls, quarantine.
Did you meet with them?
And off they go. Yes, we were obviously part of the quarantine environment.
So there's 3 French vets based in Ireland?
Based in Ireland,
Why
yes.
3 French vets?
Well, they're part of the European Union's inspection team. They have a separate department or team that goes around the world looking at all sorts of different products. And it was South Africa's turn. In fact, it was planned for this audit in sometime in 2011. Then we had the outbreak, and they said they don't want to audit us during the process of an outbreak, and therefore it was delayed until we were near the end of our 2-year suspension.
All right, let's look at the first page of the slide, Peter. We can take it so the public can be all fair with us. You're touching on government to government.
Yes, I think this is just the background as to how the whole process of moving animal products around the world. I mean, firstly, the negotiations take place between governments. Industry can support. There are 2 platforms. One is the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health. This is made up of 178 member countries, and they produce guidelines as to how to move animals or animal products based on each disease. So African horse sickness will have a code.
Are we a member country?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
So it provides a guideline, and that translates into a protocol. So each country will then look at the guidelines, incorporate the principles that they believe are important, and that's written into a protocol which we then eventually certify based on a health certificate. So that's the basics of how exporting works.
Peter, I'm going to jump in every now and then, Peter. With your trading partners, you get a health certificate. Could we go to Singapore, Hong Kong, you might get different responses?
Different because they have different disease concerns. For example, a fundamental one for Hong Kong and Singapore is that they're pyro-free, whereas Europe is pyro-infected, therefore it's not a condition that they would impose.
Pyro, would you explain that to the audience?
Pyroplasmosis, the tick-borne disease. South Africa is endemic. And it's something that some parts of the world are not, and Singapore, Hong Kong, many parts of Asia, including Australia,
is pyro
are
the
free.
Thing that stops us going?
Of course, apart from African horse sickness.
Yeah. So some countries don't worry about it?
Yeah. So Southern Europe is deemed to be infected.
Okay.
Obviously, the northern parts, we understand, are free, but of course they're part of that whole union, and therefore, a disease will dominate the rest of the importing conditions.
A lot of people have said that you have Hendra in Australia. They haven't got the limitations. Are we getting a fair crack of the whip, in your opinion?
Look, I think we'll come to that when we look at some of the discussion later on in the end of it, because you cannot look at horse sickness or horse exports in isolation. But I think let's deal with that later.
Okay, so you're happy with page 1?
Yes, happy.
Let's go to page 2 and let's have a look here. Peter, go through this for us.
Well, look, based on the fact that Africa is infected with African horse sickness, and certainly South Africa is, we can export under 3 ways. One is that we export from a free area, which we have in Cape Town. Number 2, we can export from an infected part of the world. Any part of South Africa which would be deemed to be infected, that would require total lockup conditions under vector-protected conditions. And if you maintain vector protection... Like Joburg. Which is really where we're aiming for.
Yes.
If we can find any of our trading partners to actually partner us and accept that the risk profile is actually acceptable. But I mean, you'd start vector protection from day 1 of your quarantine. Until arrival in the importing country, you have to maintain that. That's a total lockup scenario. It requires a major investment in terms of the facilities, as well as a serious amount of confidence from our trading partners. So currently we're exporting from a free area, or have been until the last outbreak, and that requires certain conditions to be met. In other words, how you maintain your movement controls, how you maintain your surveillance, and all the other conditions that make up that free area. And then, of course, America has always provided a post-arrival quarantine option. The current constraint is about finance, because number one, it's a costly logistical exercise, and secondly, it's a 60-day post-arrival quarantine, which is firstly costly on terms of monetary value, but also sitting with a horse that's a high-performance animal not being able to work is a major constraint. But it still has provided South Africa with a reasonable alternative to the current pre-export conditions that Europe, for example, accepts. So those are the basic ways of how we export out of South Africa.
Okay, let's go to slide 3, Peter, because this is post-2011 Mamre outbreak, Mamre being the area.
Mamre was the outbreak, 60 k's outside of Cape Town. 2011, first case was reported at the end of February. The last case was recorded on the 3rd of May. According to the OIE guidelines, South African Veterinary Services declared the outbreak to be officially over 40 days later, which was on the 23rd of June. So in a few weeks' time, we will reach that point, and South Africa will then apply to all its trading partners again to lift the suspension. But after the outbreak, I think it was an opportunity for Racing South Africa, who has, looked after a lot of or driven a lot of the processes towards improving the protocol environment. So we had widespread consultation with our industry. Started off with a workshop in January in Cape Town, and we went through a process which led eventually to an independent veterinary consultant employed by the Thoroughbred Racing Trust, Dr. Yusuf Burning, looking at our strategy and really giving guidance along the way, and finally recognizing that in fact we were on the right track. There was a serious amount of money attached to it. It went back to industry. Industry being Racing South Africa's major shareholders, they felt that they didn't have the means at the time to invest fully at that time. But before that, of course...
Why so much money, Peter?
Well, because, maintaining your free area is a hugely costly exercise.
Okay.
Given that it's number one, it's a government function, so veterinary services would have a major degree of responsibility in terms of resource, in terms of management, and in terms of the investment in the actual structure. And of course, private sector can contribute, but there's a limit to what racing can fund. We're going back to some of those funding issues later on in the last strata. But I think a significant situation that happened in May of 2012 was that the code changed. The OIE code for African horse sickness changed in 2012, May 2012, which introduced some fundamental changes. One, a reduction in quarantine to 14 days, which we've spoken about before, in conjunction with a real-time PCR.
Just the 14-day, is that getting out?
That's getting out. So pre-export, reduced down to 14 days.
And post?
Post-arrival depends. Europe is 0.
But
Singapore would want 14 days.
Be.
Of course, I mean, in a sense, having a post-arrival quarantine is a question of trust.
Peter, that would be such a great win.
It's a huge, huge benefit. Yes. But of course, it is attached to the real-time PCR, which is in its final phase of validation. Funding has been provided for that.
So, Peter, who's validating it?
Well, look, it's an Equine Research Centre function.
In our country?
In our country.
So
it is, the final phase is basically taking that test. The concept is done, the design is done, the reproducibility,
very, very successful.
Highly sensitive, and it picks up, obviously, it's a different form of testing for African horse sickness or any other disease compared with a serology-based test, the ELISA.
Yes.
So it's looking at a DNA level. And obviously that
so
DNA...
You take a blood?
You take a blood sample, and within a couple of hours of receiving the sample, you can get a result.
When you say very sensitive...
Highly sensitive.
Highly sensitive.
So it can pick up vaccination. In other words, serology, the ELISA picks up, if you take a sample, a cross-section of the horses in this country, most of whom have been vaccinated, they'll always show positive on a serology base, presence of antibodies.
Yes.
On the ELISA, on the real-time PCR, you're looking at a DNA level, and the amount of virus post-infection, whether it's vaccine or field, compared with 6 months down the line, will be a very much different picture. It will produce a negative result a certain period of time after a horse has been vaccinated, for example. Okay, so it is the defining point at which an importing country really is going to be able to say that horse is not viremic. So it is a fundamental breakthrough in terms of how importing countries define risk and therefore can make decisions about importing from a country which is infected.
Pete, does that cover page 3?
Not quite. I just wanted to touch base on a few areas. We did also, part of that OIE code change was that countries were then allowed to apply for freedom. South Africa applied in November of last year, and it was rejected based on an interpretation of our current free zone. Okay. And what we understand is that they want to look at increasing the free zone. From a practical management, of course, it introduces more horses to worry about. So we're not necessarily fully supportive of that. Our current free zone is very small. There are 3 registered equine holdings: Kenilworth Racecourse, Milnerton Training Centre, and the police environment. There's a total population of probably 1,500 horses, most of which are at Milnerton. If you increase the size of the free zone, and we've done a recent census on all the horses in the surveillance area, thanks to funding from the Thoroughbred Trust, and that number of horses has increased to 12,500. So you can understand the level of management and maintenance thereof. All those properties, all those horses.
Yeah.
It adds significant costs, significant responsibility, and really takes away, as a layman, my interpretation of what really constitutes risk, which is your quarantine environment plus your blood testing.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point is that South Africa applied in November. It was rejected. We're going to have to rethink our strategy and go back and either argue for the retention of the current free zone or to increase the size. That'll come in July. Then in May, we spoke about the EU audit.
Yes.
So we won't go much on that. They came at the 20th of May. They was here for 10 days. They looked at every component of that, of the veterinary environment. They were auditing 1990 plus minus legislation, which is written to EU law. There's nothing to do with the current OIE changes. So in other words, it's ancient legislation.
Yeah, it is.
And it's unemotional. It's simply, you say you're doing this, we are proving whether you are or not. Tick box, and off they go. They will present a report with it by the end of June. South Africa has a month to respond to that report.
Peter, knowing that they're coming, obviously you try to get your house in order. It's the norm. Did you feel that you were presenting them with quite a good product?
Look, given that, you need to break it up into 3 parts. One is veterinary services, where they look at the actual government department as a whole. Number 2 is the AHS controlled area. Again, what industry can provide in terms of support, what government responsibility is. And then thirdly, the quarantine environment. Lots of other things like passports, issuing of passports and movement controls and verifying that a horse came into the zone with its correct paperwork in order. Obviously quarantine, where we control entirely under the guidelines or the guidance of veterinary services in the Western Cape. Obviously it's our responsibility.
Now,
look, they're all microchipped,
yeah.
Obviously. And
so,
vector protection, Kenilworth's vector protection is the highest level of vector protection in the world. And we've had numerous veterinary inspections over the years, from Qatar to Dubai to Europe to Hong Kong, and they've all been consistent in their praise for the quarantine station. So it does its job. It does its job. It's high vector protection. The management is excellent. So anyway, the point being is that by the end of July, South Africa will have responded.
By the end of July?
End of July this year, yeah.
And Peter, let's come back in a moment. We're just going to go now for a break, and I'll come back with Peter. Right, we're back with Peter Gibson. It's very, very interesting, and we need to get to the nitty-gritties here, Peter, but we've got a lot of people out there who, the layman's the term that you used earlier, they've got to know what's going on, but we've just talking about the EU audit coming and going. Yeah. And I just want to get my dates in order. On the 23rd of June, the 2 years with the 40-day clearance is up.
Correct.
And then they're going to submit a report by the end of July.
The EU audit.
Yes.
Let's separate the 2 issues. One is that the EU audit will present a report by, call it the end of June.
Yes.
South Africa then has 25 days or so to respond, and will submit their response.
Respond? They're going to say,
well,
check this up,
the EU audit is going to say, maybe you didn't do so well here. And didn't do so well here, did very well there. South Africa now has a chance to actually either defend themselves in terms of where there's negativity, or to enhance, some of the areas that they felt that they were understated in terms of the report. So South Africa will report back at the end of July.
And we're hoping for an A+.
We would love to have an A+, but let's be realistic. It's as I said, number one, they're auditing on ancient legislation which is currently in EU law. Since then, there have been 3 code changes. Yes, look, that is happening, and that's part of the reason why they were doing an audit, is because in 2015, what I understand, is that the whole of all import conditions under the European legislation will be reviewed.